So, pain is a subjective experience that can be reliably elicited by noxious stimulation. So, we can use this device called a thermode, attach it to somebody's skin, heat it up to different temperatures, and measure how much pain that elicits. But we can also we also know that pain is directly affected by psychological factors, including things like expectation, attention, and emotion. So, it's not just the pain stimulus that matters. So, for instance, soldiers on a battlefield can continue to fight despite being wounded. That's called battlefield analgesia. And meanwhile, many different forms of chronic pain have no known uh, noxious mechanism that perpetuates the pain. In addition to this, our best clinical interventions for pain also directly influence these psychological factors. And this can happen in the context of the placebo effect, where these different types of psychological factors come together and influence responses to outcomes such as pain relief above and beyond the effect of any pharmacological treatment. And meta-analyses indicate that placebo effects are largest in pain, which has been taken by some to suggest that this really means that placebo effects on pain, or these influences of these psychological factors on pain, are really just report biases. However, because pain is subjective, this really creates an opportunity to specify the influence of these non-specific psychological factors, combine them with treatment, and maximize pain relief, because in the end, the person's pain is what matters. And this is critically important right now, where we're in midst of a kind of joint epidemic between both chronic pain and also the opioid epidemic. And in addition to kind of the clinical significance of this, there are a couple of different reasons why I think that neuroscientists in general should think more about pain in their relation to their own research. So firstly, I mentioned the clinical significance. Over 100 million adults in the US are affected by chronic pain. Because of the opioid epidemic, we do need better treatments, including non-pharmacological interventions that shape pain. There are huge health disparities in pain. So women and non-white individuals are less likely to be treated for their pain, despite experiencing more pain, both in the clinic and in laboratory experiments. Pain's highly comorbid with anxiety and depression. And as I mentioned, the largest placebo effects are in pain, suggesting that psychological and brain factors directly influence pain outcomes. In addition, from a basic experimental standpoint, pain elicits a coordinated response across levels of the nervous system. So you can ask kind of from the periphery to the central nervous system, where along the factor of an incoming stimulus reaching the brain do different types of psychological factors have their effects. The pathways that transfer pain to the brain are highly conserved across species. So we have great translational models for different aspects of pain. As I mentioned, we can objectively manipulate the noxious stimulus, which makes it very different from other areas of affective neuroscience. And finally, pain itself is a subjective percept. And so really you can separate out the response to the noxious stimulus from all the decision-making factors that go into someone deciding what their specific pain is. And lastly, pain has both sensory and affective components, and these seem to rely on distinct neural circuits to some extent. And so there's all these interesting kind of angles at which pain is fascinating and clinically necessary for us to understand now. So today I'm going to be talking about the psychological and neural mechanisms of pain perception. I'll give some background on the cognitive neuroscience of pain and nociception. I'll focus then on how psychological factors shape pain, focusing on placebo analgesia and how expectations affect pain, and then causal contributions of the orbitofrontal cortex or ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and wrap up with some outstanding questions. So turning first to just kind of some basic definitions, pain is defined as an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage or described in terms of such damage. And this is distinct from nociception, which is defined as the neural process of encoding noxious stimuli. So the subjective experience itself, whether or not it depends on noxious input is what we're talking about when we talk about pain. And pain has both sensory or discriminative aspects, meaning your ability to localize the pain or describe what kind of pain it is or its intensity, and affective components, which is more the motivational aspects of pain, the unpleasantness and the things that make you want to escape pain. We really talk about three types of pain. So there's transient pain, which activate nociceptive transducers in skin or other tissues in the body in the absence of any tissue damage. It's ubiquitous. We all experience it all the time, but you don't need to seek healthcare. And this is what we can manipulate in the lab with things like a device called a thermode here in the upper left, shock, pressure pain, laser, many different types of torture devices that we administer to individuals where they can really tell us how much pain they're willing to tolerate in the lab. Acute pain refers to substantial injury of body tissue and activation of nociceptive transducers at the site of local tissue damage. In this case, pain ends before healing occurs. And in many of these cases, people do seek treatment to reduce pain or expedite healing. So things like trauma, surgery, and diseases. And then finally, in chronic pain, the intensity of pain is out of proportion to the original injury or tissue damage. And it's commonly triggered by an injury or disease, but may be perpetuated by factors other than the cause of the pain. And there are many different types of chronic pain, some of which are mentioned here. And Dr. Apkarian will be talking about those later today. In my lab, we really focus primarily on this kind of transient pain because we're interested in being able to manipulate the stimulus and test how psychological factors change people's response to it. So the way that looks is we heat it up to different temperatures and we measure pain. And for each individual, we kind of can fit an iterative process to determine their pain threshold, which is the beginning of pain. So level 2, let's say, on this 8-point scale. Their pain tolerance, which is the maximum pain they're willing to tolerate. And we find that people are pretty good in terms of reliability across visits. So intraclass correlations of about 0.6 for both pain threshold, which is the start of pain, and pain tolerance. And so this really gives us the opportunity to manipulate the stimulus and measure pain. And of course, before getting into psychological aspects of pain, one question is, how does this in turn affect the brain's response to pain? So historically, before fMRI, this was really there was a large debate about whether or not the brain contributes to pain. So from lesion work, Head and Holt showed you could have parietal lesions and people could still experience pain. However, cingulotomy, S1 and S2 lesions can actually mitigate pain. So this lesion work kind of wasn't completely definitive about the brain's role in pain. Similarly, we have mixed results from the famous work from Penfield versus later work suggesting that you can get pain with S1 stimulation, as well as that stimulation of the PAG and thalamus can relieve pain. And finally, in the 80s, there was a lot of foundational work on primate electrophysiology, indicating that there are nociceptive neurons in the thalamus, S1 and S2, or area 7B. However, as I mentioned, pain is a subjective experience, and so we can't actually ask a monkey how much pain it's feeling. And so this really kind of, remained a debate about which regions in the brain are sensitive to pain and which cause pain. And fortunately, with the advent of neuroimaging, we've had a huge explosion of research in this area. I'm not going to be talking about PET imaging, but obviously there was a whole decade of PET work before fMRI kind of took over. But here's a figure of the increase in pain fMRI papers over time that Massi Maedi, Tim Solomons, and I put together in a primer of pain neuroimaging for folks who are learning pain imaging. I'll point you to that primer. And so what we really see across studies of pain, so this is a mini meta-analysis, a mega-analysis across 5 studies that compared high versus low intensity heat stimulation, is reliable activation of brain regions involved in pain sensory components, including the lateral thalamus, primary and secondary somatosensory cortex, posterior insula, and brain regions involved in pain affect, including the thalamus, cingulate, anterior insula, as well as regions involved in more motivation and motor components. And I'll just highlight immediately that these networks, particularly the affective network, overlap with what we really have come to refer to as the salience network, as well as the brain regions involved in interoception. So these are maps from Neurosynth doing term-based meta-analysis. And so the question really has come about for a while now, asking whether brain responses in the so-called pain matrix are specific to pain. Now, fortunately, with machine learning, we've been able to develop signature patterns. So this is a pattern of weights within voxels that can predict with high reliability in new subjects and new scanners and in new studies whether a condition is painful or not, and which of two conditions is more painful. And the accuracy is up to 100%, sometimes pretty much between 90 and 100% on every sample we've tried. This was trained in heat pain, but it can predict pain in all types of modalities. And it's highly specific to pain. So we don't see activation of this signature pattern with other types of aversive stimuli during pain anticipation or other types of unpleasant events. I'll also mention that it doesn't transfer to chronic pain. So we do think that there's differences between this type of transient acute pain and chronic pain, although the neurologic pain signature is highly predictive for types of transient pain. So with this really provides us the opportunity to kind of take this cognitive neuroscience approach to pain imaging, where we can manipulate psychological factors and the noxious stimulus, measure things like reported pain, autonomic responses, mediation by different pain networks, and then test how brain responses to pain differ as a function of patient diagnosis, in health disparities, different demographics or sociocultural group, and finally combining this alongside pharmacology to understand how different analgesics might affect brain responses to pain. So turning now to the question of how psychological factors shape pain. There's really a predictive processing model of placebo that kind of drives most of the work in this field. The idea is that through things like the social dynamics with a provider, the treatment context, or cues that have been associated with relief in the past, individuals have some kind of expectation or prior, which shapes how they respond to a stimulus. And based on how they respond, they make some sort of inference about their subjective response. So in a placebo effect for pain, they might determine they're feeling less pain. In a placebo effect for depression, you might have reduced, improved mood. However, because these outcomes are subjective and that we see the largest placebo responses in subjective outcomes, then that's why people have hypothesized that this could be related to a simple report bias. The idea is that you change your decision making, and so you increase your threshold for calling something painful without actually changing the underlying response itself. So the question really comes up, to what extent is the brain response to pain changing? And the first evidence that there really are changes related to pain in response to placebo came in 1978 by Levine, Gordon, and Fields, who used the wisdom tooth extraction and administered placebo after people had their wisdom teeth removed. This is pain on the y-axis and time on the x-axis with placebo administration right here. And I don't know if you can see the pointer. I'll go ahead with laser pointer. And then they administered the opioid antagonist naloxone to half of the participants. And what you see is that pain is greater when naloxone is administered, suggesting that naloxone is blocking endogenous opioid release by placebo. So the placebo effect is mediated by the release of endogenous opioids. Now, there was some controversy about this immediately, about whether naloxone was simply enhancing pain, but this study was replicated a number of times, and also studies using carfentanil to image mu opioid receptor binding showed that placebos engage mu opioid receptor binding, which in turn reduces pain. Other studies have also shown that if you administer naloxone during neuroimaging, this is work from Eipert out of Christian Buchel's group during his PhD showed that if you administer naloxone during pain processing, you reduce responses to pain in pain-related regions. Now, kind of broadly, the way that we've tried to tease apart beyond just the naloxone opioid aspect, how expectations shape pain, is by using a couple different approaches. There's too many people in each of these areas for me to list citations, but people use pain predictive cues, so classical conditioning to induce expectations about different levels of heat, placebo analgesia, where individuals will be told about to expect pain relief in response to a given treatment, and analgesic treatments that are delivered when people know they're getting the treatment and have expectations for relief versus hidden administration of the same drug. I'll be focusing primarily on these types of pain predictive cues today. So the idea here is people go through a calibration. We find levels for each individual that elicit low, medium, and high pain. And then we combine instructions and conditioning to induce expectations. So we tell people when you hear this cue, low pain will follow. And when you hear this cue, high pain will follow. We then go through conditioning phase where we reinforce those expectations. And then after conditioning, on 50% of trials, usually we introduce a moderate temperature of heat that is preceded by either cue. And so this provides a test of the extent to which cue-based expectations modulate responses to the exact same temperature. And what we find pretty much across every single individual we've ever run this study on is that the low heat cue reduces pain by about 20% relative to the high pain cue. So again, these two bars in the middle here are the exact same temperature. And these effects are highly consistent within individuals over time, as well as across individuals. When we look at brain responses to the medium stimulus, what we find is, first of all, that every single region that responds to changes in temperature also shows reductions as a function of expectancy cues. When we look at the low cue relative to the high cue in the medium heat condition, and that responses in the insula, thalamus, and dorsal anterior cingulate formally mediate the relationship between these pain predictive cues and subjective pain on medium heat trials. So just to show you what the response looks like in the left anterior insula here, this is the cue. And what you see is the response is really not coming on until the heat period, depicted here in red. And what you see if you look at the two medium conditions, the orange versus the yellow, is that there's a much larger insular response to heat in response to the high pain cue, and that in fact there's no difference when the low cue is presented as a function of whether you're getting low stimulation or medium stimulation if you're expecting low pain. We have really robust effects in this test that replicate across different contexts and groups, including when people are getting the opioid analgesic remifentanil through an IV, when we manipulate attention to the cues, and across development as well as in youth with anxiety. So these are really robust effects of these expectancy cues. And so we then wanted to ask kind of to what extent does this transfer to the placebo effect? So in our stimulus expectancy manipulation, or cue-based expectancy manipulation, where there are expectations about the stimulus, we're combining instructions and conditioning. And similarly, in most studies of placebo, people are told that a treatment will relieve pain, even though it doesn't have any actual analgesic properties in the drug itself. It's just skin cream. During conditioning phase, the stimulus is reduced on a site that people believe is the treatment relative to a site that people believe is just skin cream or some kind of control cream. And that reinforces the expectation from instructions. And then similarly to the cue-based task, during a test phase, people receive the exact same stimulation on both sites. So we performed a meta-analysis across studies of expectancy effects on pain, both stimulus and treatment expectancy. And what we found is that there were reliable decreases once again in the insula, thalamus, and dorsal anterior cingulate, those affective components of pain that I mentioned earlier. In addition, we found reliable modulatory increases in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the striatum, linking this type of pain modulation with general cognitive control and affective value in learning. We've since gone back and tested how these types of expectancies modulate the NPS. And what we find is that we have robust effects of expectancy cues on the NPS response to medium heat. So there's no activation of the NPS when medium heat is preceded by low pain cues relative to high pain cues. However, the placebo effect does not impact the neurologic pain signature, despite the fact that we see, this is a meta-analysis of 600 individuals going through placebo from the placebo consortium. So even though there's reliable reductions in pain, there's no reliable placebo effect on the NPS. So to summarize our findings with expectancy, we see that expectations strongly shape subjective pain, and pain-related responses are modulated by expectations, particularly in affective components of the pain matrix. And so this really brings up the question about whether this is just salience we're seeing, and how specific is this modulation to pain. So some really great work has been done on this by Gil Sharvit and a couple of folks in Christian Buchel's group. We found that the neurologic pain signature is modulated by pain predictive cues, but not placebo. There's a new meta-analysis suggesting that there's strong heterogeneity across individuals in the placebo effect. So that might be why. That came out this week, and I encourage people to look at that paper. And we've hypothesized that this might be because these depend on separate mechanisms. The idea is that placebo engages long-lasting pain modulation through endogenous opioids and descending modulation, whereas cue-based expectancy effects might depend on phasic dopaminergic prediction errors. And I believe that will be a little bit of a transition to Flavia's talk today. Now, most of these studies combined instructions and learning. And so one question is really how these effects emerge. I think I just have about 5 minutes left, but I should be okay. So one hypothesis is that expectations inhibit responses similar to cognitive control and emotion regulation. The idea here then would be that expectations would influence responses in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the rostral anterior cingulate, which in turn would downregulate brain responses to pain. Alternatively, expectations might change the value of pain. So as you learn through feedback, you develop expectations through value-based learning. And if this is the case, we'd expect to see cues induce responses in the striatum and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So we tested this by looking at the anticipatory period. And what we found is that responses in the striatum and VMPFC did indeed formally mediate expectancy effects on pain processing regions, consistent with their role in reinforcement learning models. And so this really suggests that a domain general system involved in evaluating predictive cues and generating value is important for shaping domain-specific responses, in this case pain, which in turn shapes subjective experience. We're currently testing this idea of modality specificity by comparing pain with pleasant and unpleasant tastes. You can see here that we get strong cue-based modulation in all conditions. And as I mentioned, Sharvit and Fazeli have also done similar work looking at expectancy effects across domains.
Sorry, Dr. Atlas, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but that's gone over the 20 minutes. I just wanted to let you know. I'm not sure if you heard me before.
Oh, I didn't hear you before. Thank you. So I will stop here. And let me just go to try to get to my summary slide, or I'll just stop here and we can take questions. I can't figure out how to get to the last slide.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm applauding, and I'm sure 1,200 other people are doing so, but I'm muted. That was really fantastic overview.